what's most important about these protests is not necessarily what they're communicating to decision makers in this moment, but instead the connections that are being built, these opportunities for citizens to educate themselves together, solve problems together. That is the crucial underpinning of democratic citizenship. And when you have fewer and fewer places where people can go to do that, it's no wonder that we have a fraying of democratic society.
Welcome to The Stakes. I'm Brad Rourke with the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan operating foundation that focuses on advancing and defending inclusive democracy. Today, I'm talking to Kettering Foundation Research Fellow and Professor of Political Science at Brown University, Dr. Deva Woodley. Dr. Woodley, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited for our conversation.
So am I. We're talking the day after what has been called Good Trouble Continues On Day. And maybe a month ago, there was what was known as No King's Day. Both of these national mobilizations, protests and organizing. Deva, what does protest and organizing look like right now?
So right now we are in what has been an ongoing cycle of protest, a cycle of contention, as people in social movement studies call it, that's actually been ongoing the entire 21st century, starting right around 1999-2000 with what were called the anti-globalization protests at that time. They were really protests against the emergent power of the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund. And since that time, there have been very close waves of protest activity happening basically every few years on different topics in the United States context and also globally. Now, in 2025, we see in the United States case a series of protests that are ongoing and that have been quite widespread that are expressing concern about democratic backsliding, the perceived sort of incursion of executive power, presidential power over the other branches of government, the centralization of power, and something like de-democratization.
Is there anything different or new about the protests that we're seeing now? I'm thinking especially about No Kings that wasn't true earlier in the century.
What's happening now is that people are protesting in their own communities. And this is in part, I think, because what people have found is that in the 21st century, we have fewer and fewer of these organizations that are neighborhood clubs, bowling leagues, secret societies, fraternities, membership-based organizations that are locally rooted. Those used to be the way that people got the word out about when to come together for protests. But since the advent of the internet and especially social media, there is a totally different way for people to be called together based on concerns that they have in common, but not necessarily based on interpersonal connections that they may share. What we have found is that those interpersonal connections and those civic spaces that endure between the times of protest are actually extremely important for building power, for influence, and power to call decision makers to account, and also for support and resilience in resistance.
So are there more of those in local settings then? I mean, so I'm thinking about these protests that they're happening all over different places rather than the major urban centers. Is that in part not only because it's easier to reach people in their towns and communities to do something there, but also are there ways that they can sustain themselves in local settings more? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
I think that people are trying to sustain themselves in local settings more. And it's actually not easier to reach people locally than it is to necessarily reach people across your social media feed. I think that's part of what people are trying to build right now and what makes this moment of gathering together different. Because people are not only gathering together for protests, people are also gathering together in attempts at economic non-cooperation, right? Boycotts of various kinds. And in order to have the capacity to do things like that, you have to be really rooted in your local community. You have to have relationships with people that help you to bypass or work around the way that you normally do things because those avenues are no longer open to you. So what's happening, I think, is that people are trying to build locally so that they can create those interpersonal connections and community connections that are substantive between protests. So about once a month, there are these national protests that are happening both in major cities, but also in localities. And the frequency is important is because you start to see people that you know, right, at these events that become somewhat regularized. So it's a way to make connections and show that you have shared values and show that you're paying attention and also to learn information that you otherwise might not know.
You've got a blog post on the Kettering Foundation's website, No Kings, Just Citizens, which I commend to our viewers to read. In that article, you make a point that there appears to be more protest activity going on now than there was in the previous Trump administration, and it's quite a large amount of protest. Is that continuing to hold, and is there maybe even more than we're seeing?
Yes. So the differences between, for example, protest waves that were taking place in the 2010s during the first Trump administration and now is that while there were larger one-day protests during that time period, so for example, the Women's March was a protest that had 3 million people in different major U.S. cities across the nation, and then the largest protest mobilization ever, the Black Lives Matter movement during 2020, involved somewhere between 20 and 25 million people. Those protests took place often centered, sort of one day at a time, and they weren't necessarily ongoing throughout the entire administration, right? It's not that you have more people involved on any one day, right? During the No Kings protests, for example, there were about 5 million people involved, we think, right, across the United States. However, right before the No Kings protests, the month before, in March, you had about 3 million people who were involved. We don't have the counts for what has happened for Good Trouble Day, but there's probably a couple million people involved this time as well. So it's a different pattern of protest, but what's most important about these protests is not necessarily what they're communicating to decision makers in this moment, but instead the connections that are being built so that people are able to, one, be a credible threat to decision makers who, and when I mean an electoral threat, to decision makers who are not accountable to them in this moment during election time. Two, that they're making connections with others so that they can mobilize credible candidates that they would like to run in primaries and elections against decision makers who are not accountable to them, and also creating local and regional parallel institutions, right, civic institutions, where people can come together and get resources that they may need, right, as things become more expensive or the environment becomes more repressive, and also where they can come together and get information that they think is good, get analysis or develop analysis about all of the things that are sort of happening in the news, which can be sort of hard to keep up with. It's basically a training ground or a space for democratic citizenship that we really, really need, right? So if you keep seeing someone at the protest, right, first Hands Off, then No Kings, then Good Trouble, and they live in your neighborhood or they live in the next town, it may give you incentive to ask them to your book group. It may give you incentive to create have a mom's dinner, for example.
Yeah, or create a book group. Maybe you don't have a book group.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. So these are occasions for people to meet and make connections. And this is one of the things that political scientists, and I count myself among them, right? Even though we've known all of this about civil society, obviously, for decades, I don't think that we've taken it seriously enough. Because the thing is that these connections, these opportunities for citizens to educate themselves together, solve problems together, to develop trust and connections with one another, to learn about institutions locally, but also at the state and national scale. That is crucial. That is the crucial underpinning of democratic citizenship. And when you have fewer and fewer places where people can go to do that, it's no wonder that we have a fraying of democratic society. People are realizing that that's what needs to be rebuilt. And people are realizing that that needs to happen in both directly political ways, but also ways that are not necessarily directly political. They're about community connection. They're about problem solving together.
Thinking about there's this sort of new way of protesting and organizing. Is there anything that's been lost? Are there lessons from the past, even earlier this century, or even much further back into the 60s and 70s?
Well, I think that actually the corollary to this period is not the 60s and 70s, but is instead the turn of last century. And I do know that organizers are looking back to that moment. Because the thing about the mid 20th century, the 50s and 60s, is that the movements that were built during that time, and really even earlier, they were built on the strata of civil society organizations that had been built at the turn of the last century, right? That had been built basically from the 1880s to the 1920s. That was the time when America's civil society actually became quite robust, and it was unique in the world. And so that is the time I think that organizers and scholars are looking back to see, oh, what were they doing at that moment?
What are the lessons to learn from that precedent-setting time?
I think there are two really important lessons, one of which I've been banging on about the whole time, which is civil society, make those connections, do those organizations. Nothing is too small, right? Every garden club, every union hall, right? Every church, whether they're religious or not, right? There are civic churches as well, right? Like all of those gatherings, they make a difference because they increase our democratic capacity and skill sets. That's one thing. The second thing that I think is really important is that during that time, they also were more conscious than I think we are, at least as yet, that they were building a new world. They were very conscious that they were setting up a 20th century that was going to be really different from the 19th century. And that, I think, ambition is missing from this moment. And it's something that we need to recover, because it's not fantastical to think that we have as much capacity, duty, and responsibility to make the 21st century as much better as the 20th was from the 19th.
Kettering Foundation Research Fellow, Professor of Political Science at Brown University, Dr. Deva Woodley, thank you for being here.
Thank you.